So let's hear from heaven by reading the scriptures in Matthew chapter 2. This week we're going to be looking at verses 1 to 12. Now, I took, before I get there, I just want to just let you know I took an extra week to get things done because I kind of pivoted on how to do this study, and I'll explain it to you as we go along. So let me read chapter 2, verses 1 to 12. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the king of Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who was born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chiefs, priests, and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for it is written, for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time that the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Okay, so when we read the Gospels, once you read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels, you'll see that that Matthew's account gives us very little of Jesus' birth, whereas Mark tells us nothing at all about Jesus' birth, but then Luke goes into a little bit more detail on what's going on. So we have very little information from Matthew on what we're reading and what we need to understand. So that's why I had to pivot a little bit. I had to change up my study, so I had to restudy everything because, and I'll explain that in a second. Now, Matthew starts off with, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea. We don't know how long after his birth that this event happened. Some scholars think it was somewhere between 6 to 18 months. Others think it was as much as possibly 3 years. So let's just, for argument's sake, we're going to say, okay, this happened, and we are going to see in next week's study why we think it's probably somewhere between 1 and 2 years. All right. So my study, when I was studying last week, I was trying to figure out how I would go with this. And I've told you before, I've listened to a few pastor Bible teachers who explain the Bible. They give expository teaching, which means they take the Bible and they break it down verse by verse. They do it a lot more than what I'm doing, but I'm kind of doing that. Might want to call this a quasi exposition of the Bible, because remember, my purpose here is to not I don't want these lessons to be, a half hour, an hour and a half long. I don't want that. Okay, I want to be able to present this to you in a simple way and easy to understand, and hopefully prompt you to want to study more. That's the whole goal, for you to study. So when I was studying, I came across this. I came across what I'm about to present to you through a sermon by Dr. John MacArthur. I've been listening to him for many years. You've heard me mention him plenty of times. And what the Holy Spirit showed me through his sermon gave me one of those aha moments. Now, some of what he taught me in this sermon that I was listening to him, some of this I kind of already understood, but there was a lot more. He went into a lot more depth and a lot more detail, and that brought this out to me. And this is what I'm compelled to share with you. All right, so his sermon was about an hour long, and I think it's actually in two parts, because I think it's almost 2 hours long in a couple of parts. But for my purposes, I want to do this in about 15 to 20 minutes, just to keep things the way they have been. And I don't want to lose you. That's the thing, is I don't really want this to become a history lesson, but really it kind of is. I'm going to be giving you history over preaching, if you will. Now, whenever we hear the story of Jesus' birth, there's always mentioned three wise men. And that's what we have here. We heard that during the time of Herod, Magi from the east came. Now, Matthew doesn't say there's three, but we even have a hymn out during Christmas time that's called "We Three Kings," and "We Three Kings of Orient are," and they did come from the Orient. And the reason that a lot of people think that there were only three of them is because of the gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But I'm going to talk about that later on too. Now, to find out. Well, first of all, besides the fact that there weren't three, there were probably a lot, and we're going to talk about that also. Now, to find out who they were, we need to know where they came from. And part of where they came from is in the Bible, and other parts are in history, historical accounts. And the Bible does mention who these people were, but not directly. Like we know these are Magi here in what I read, but in the Bible in the Old Testament especially, refers to them indirectly. So to do that, a little bit of history. So I want to give you history. I want to talk to you. I'm going to present some biblical passages, but I'm also going to talk to you as a history teacher would talk to you. And I personally find history to be fascinating. And I love God's word. God's word is fascinating. And when you put the two of them together, yeah, okay, I'm in my wheelhouse with this. All right, so up until the time of Christ, there were four major world empires throughout history. There were the Babylonians, there were the Medo-Persians, that would be the Medes and the Persians together. Then there was the Greek, and then there was the Roman Empire, and then that was the order it came in. Now, the Jews were held captive by as slaves by the Babylonians and then by the Medo-Persians. They weren't really held captive by the Greeks. When the Greeks took over, the Greeks didn't really care about them. When Rome defeated the Greeks and overtook as the world-leading empire, they controlled Israel. They didn't keep them in slavery, but they controlled them and they oppressed them. All right, not much of a difference, but they weren't kept as slaves like the Babylonians and the Medes had kept them. So the first people that we see in this story are the wise men from the east. Now, we don't know how long after Jesus was born that these men arrived in Jerusalem. When they did arrive, they would do what most travelers would do, especially from other civilizations, is they would meet with the king, and they met with Herod. We just read that. And they told Herod that they had saw his star rise in the east and that they followed it to Jerusalem. So here's a little information about the Magi to get you more familiar with them, to understand and to see how God worked history using them to come up to the time of Jesus' birth. Now, history teaches us that these wise men were a priestly group associated with the Medes, and the Medes were an eastern tribe past Persia, which is what we know as Iran and Iraq now, and possibly into Afghanistan, India, more towards China in that area. So that's the Orient, the East. They could have gone back as far as when Abraham was in Ur of the Chaldees, which you remember we talked about when we studied him back in the beginning of our study with Abraham when we were in Genesis chapter 12. So there's a little bit of familiarity with them. So they were probably existed at the same time as Abraham. They existed at the same time that Abraham eventually became, his family become the Jewish nation. So there's a lot of parallel, and there's a lot of commingling going together. All right. Actually, that was redundant. Commingling together, same thing. Sorry about that. Now, the ancient Greek word that the Bible was written in, is the word for magi is magos. The plural is magoi, which is where we get the term magi from. We pronounce it magi, the Greeks pronounce it magoi. At least I think they do. That's what listen, remember, I'm not a Greek scholar, but I did a lot of reading on this to understand that it's probably pronounced magoi. Now, the word is not translatable, and some scholars tell us that it was a tribe of people among the Medes, but there are other scholars that tell us that it wasn't, that they weren't a tribe, that they were just a group of influential people. Regardless, they came from the Medes. They came from the Far East. Now, during the Babylonian and the Medo-Persian empires, these magi were prominent, and they were heavily relied upon by the rulers of those empires for in a couple of ways. One, they were well versed in astronomy and astrology and science and math, so the kings relied on. Essentially, they were smarter than the kings. So that because of their knowledge and because of what they were able to present, they were relied heavily by the rulers to, for the most part, interpret dreams. Because it's like anything else. Everyone has dreams that they want interpreted, and kings, because of their egos, they had to have them interpreted. So they relied upon these people to help them out in that respect. Another thing is that they were, and I'll talk about this later on, but they were also king makers. They, and I'll discuss that later on. But that's how heavily influential they were. Now, at the same time that they were among the Babylonians, the Medes, and the Persians, remember, the Jewish people were being held captive, so they commingled with the Jewish people. And one of those people that they commingled with was Daniel. Now, Daniel has a book in the Bible, and we are going to read to him. We're going to read him now, but we're also going to look at his book eventually. Daniel was a man of God, and God had. I don't want to get too far into the story because I don't want to lose that part. All right, but Daniel was a man of God, and we're told in his book in chapter 1 that the king knew he was a very smart man, knew a lot, could be very influential, and could help the king out. So the king had put him in charge of these magi. That was Daniel's group. And there's a story in that book that in the first in chapter 2 that the king was Nebuchadnezzar. The Babylonian king was Nebuchadnezzar, and he had a dream, and he needed this dream interpreted. Now, I'm not going to read the entire chapter because I don't want to take us away from that. I just want to present the story, the gist of the story to you. So he had this dream, and he needed it interpreted. So he called his magicians. This is Val's coming up. He called his magicians and his astrologers and his diviners in to interpret the dream. And he told them that if they failed, he was going to cut them into pieces. And with that, he had also told them that if they were successful, they would be met with great reward. So they told him, the Magi, now these are the Magi people, they told him that it was impossible to interpret this dream. So the king ordered to have them executed. And because Daniel was in charge of them, the king Nebuchadnezzar had also ordered Daniel to be... I'm not, from now, listen, I've told you before, when I do these, if he comes up or if Troy comes up, I am not going to start over again. I'm just going to leave this as part of God's gift to us. The king had ordered also, because by association was going to order the execution of Daniel. Now, when the commander who was going to execute them, I think Val's going to settle down now. When the commander was coming to execute him, and Daniel had convinced him to give him time. He had convinced him to have an audience with Nebuchadnezzar. So when Daniel went to have his audience with Nebuchadnezzar, he convinced Nebuchadnezzar. He said, "Give me time." He says, "I need time," because what Daniel would do is when he was put in these pressure situations, he would ask for time. And what Daniel would do is he would go pray about it. And Daniel and his friends, what they did a lot of was they did fasting and praying. So this way they could concentrate fully on God and wait for God to tell them what they needed to know. And in this case was no different. So Daniel went in and convinced Nebuchadnezzar to give him time to interpret the dream. So then eventually Daniel would get this message from God on what Nebuchadnezzar's dream was about. So Daniel disclosed this meaning to Nebuchadnezzar, which, by the way, was not good news for Nebuchadnezzar. But Nebuchadnezzar paid great tribute to Daniel because Daniel was able to interpret the dream for him. And for that, because Nebuchadnezzar said your interpretation would be met with great reward, he put Daniel in an even higher position and absolute authority over the Magi. And Nebuchadnezzar also did something else. He praised God. And that's exciting in itself because Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians were pagans. They did not believe in God. They did not believe the God of Israel. And he gave God great praise. Now, later on in Daniel chapter 5, there's another king, King Belshazzar, who he saw these human hands appear to write something on the wall. Now, the Bible tells us in the story that they were just hands. That's all he was. He saw hands writing something on the wall, and he didn't know. And he was scared because of what he saw. So being in an agitated state, his queen told him later on in Daniel chapter 5, verse 11, she says this, "May the king live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners." So again, Belshazzar had a dream that the Magi couldn't interpret. So the queen had told Belshazzar about this man, Daniel, that can do it. So Daniel came in and interpreted the dream for Belshazzar. So now you see, for the past few decades, Daniel was put in charge of the Magi, during which time he had every opportunity to teach them the Jewish scriptures. And obviously, one of those stories that he would teach them was the promise of the coming Messiah. So you see here the Magi, these ancient people who were commingling and living alongside the Jews for a couple of centuries and being taught by one of the strongest godly men there, Daniel, they learned about the coming Messiah. They learned Jewish history. They learned everything about who the Jews were. And a lot of that had to do with God, the one true God, and the coming Messiah. I just think this part, when I started seeing all that, I was fascinated. I was like, okay, now I'm seeing how it all together. It was, like I said, it was one of those aha moments. Now, continuing with this little bit of a history lesson, after the Babylonians came the Medes and the Persians, and they were ruled by Darius the Great. And see, I've already known this. I love this history. So bear with me, okay? Just indulge me, all right? Now, Darius would proclaim one religion for his kingdom, Zoroastrianism. Now, among the nuances of Zoroastrianism is the influence of astrology and astronomy is what the influence that astronomy and astrology have on creation. Now, they were also monotheistic, the Magi. Monotheistic means they believe in one true God who was the creator of the universe. All right. So with this new decree, the Magi would grow even more influential as history unfolds towards our time in Matthew chapter 2 and the birth of Christ. You see how it's all starting to come together. You have these people, many hundreds of years, centuries, many centuries before, commingling with the Jews, learning about God, learning about the coming Messiah, learning about all of this. They were well versed in astronomy and astrology, so of course they would see a star up in the heavens, and the star would appear to them, and they would follow this star because that was how inquisitive they were. They were following what they knew to do, and God was leading them right there. You see, the between the lines story is that these were Gentiles. All right. So God was not only coming to the Jews, but he was also bringing the Gentiles in with him. And as we learn the scriptures and as we look more at the Gospels, we are going to see how important it was for God to get his message to the Gentiles. All right. So, as history moved on, and these Magi grew more influential and more powerful, their power became so great that no man could become king in the Orient unless he was approved and crowned by the Magi. And he could not get that far until he mastered the wisdom of the Magi. And this would be known as the law of the Medes. And in the Old Testament, we see that phrase throughout. The law of the Medes had to do with the wisdom of the Magi. Another thing that God is bringing both aspects of civilization. He's bringing the Jews and the Gentiles together. And it's taking him a couple of centuries to do this. And that's how God works. God works in his time, and it's usually, and when you look back at it, you can see how he did that. All right, so now we have a little bit of understanding of who these people were and where they came from. Now, remember, I told you that there weren't only three of them. We know that they were a group of people. They were a sect within the Medes, and that they were probably well numbered in civilization. And also we have to understand that in those ancient times, if there was long travel required, these people went caravans. And when you go in a caravan, you're going with a healthy number of people, because you have to have people that can travel. Without getting into the logistics of it, it's like if you had 100 people together, they're not all making the trip in one shot. A couple of them are going to go here, a couple of them are going to go there, but they have to take all these provisions and all this protection with them. Now, keep in mind that the gifts that they brought, the gold, frankincense, and myrrh, were of the highest valued spices and minerals that were there at the time. So there was no way only three of these guys were going to do that. There had to be more, because they would have to protect that. So this brings us to the time of Jesus' birth in Matthew chapter 2. So arriving on the scene is this caravan of very powerful people, very powerful men. They were kingmakers. They were well influenced. They were well financed and very influential. And they were heading into town looking for the person who, as they claim to Herod, was born the king of the Jews. And Herod knows this. And just a little bit of side piece on history on this. The Roman Empire was pretty much most of Europe and northern Africa at the time, and very little in Palestine area where the Jews are, where Israel is. And there was still warring factions from the east. And it wasn't the Babylonians or the Medes, because they were gone, but there were still warring factions that were still giving the Romans problems along the Palestinian border. And Herod knew this. Herod absolutely knew what was going on. And he saw these kingmakers. He saw these very influential kingmakers coming, wanting to know where the king of the Jews was. Herod was already the king of the Jews, but when they said, who was born the King of the Jews. Herod knew that something was wrong, something was going on. No wonder why he was scared. And you see what God's doing here. I love how God is bringing this all together over a couple of centuries. And for us, we can look at it and go, you know what? This event that happened 2,000 years ago is an assurance for us that God knows what we want. God will take care of us. God will work everything out for us because he did it here. He did it here with the birth of Christ. It's just a fascinating story to me. Again, there's so much more in this that I could have gone on for another 45 minutes on this. But I just wanted to give that to you. I just wanted to show you who these Magi were. I think it's a fascinating concurrency of history. Next week, we're going to take a look at Herod. We're going to see a little bit more about him and to understand his role in this. So anyway, but I just want you to know, these things are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah and he's the Son of God, and that by believing you may have eternal life in him. Have yourself a great week.